Welcome back to Narratives in Black, the podcast where we shine a light on the catalysts, change makers, and community leaders shaping the stories of Black excellence in Boston and beyond. Today, we're honored to be joined by a resilient and deeply inspiring leader whose legacy stretches across generations. Paul Glass is a longtime advocate for LGBTQ plus justice, a 9/11 survivor, and a co-founder of LGBTQ plus Elders of Color, a program he now coordinates through the Multicultural AIDS Coalition. Born and raised in Roxbury, Paul lived in New York City from 1979 to 2002, where he built a 25-year career with Verizon Communications. After surviving the tragedy of 9/11 and taking early retirement, he returned to Massachusetts, this time to Cape Cod, where his full-time journey in advocacy truly began. Diagnosed with HIV in 1987, Paul considers himself a long-term survivor and has used his lived experience to advocate for marginalized communities ever since. From unexpectedly witnessing the Stonewall Uprising in 1969 to becoming a fierce voice for LGBTQ plus Elders of Color, Paul's life bridges pivotal moments in American history with enduring community-driven action. He's received numerous accolades, including the Bayard Rustin Award for Courage, the GLAAD Leadership Award, and AARP's Andrus Award for Community Service. Today, we'll explore the moments that shaped him, the movements he's helped build, and the future he envisions for advocacy and care. Paul Glass, welcome to Narratives in Black.
Thank you, Amanda.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing fine.
I'm so excited to interview you.
Well, it seems so funny when I hear my life being said back to me.
I mean, it's been a beautiful, prosperous life at that, but we just getting into the nooks and crannies of things. So, you grew up in Roxbury, which I live in Roxbury now, which is historic. But you grew up in a really tumultuous time in the civil rights movement. How did that era influence your sense of justice and your path to advocacy?
Oh boy. Well, when I was living in Roxbury, of course I was a young man, a child at that time.
You're still a young man.
Nice of you to say, but I don't always feel like that. But I can tell you, it was, you know, as a child, you don't always realize the depth of your surroundings. Oftentimes, it's always about play and things to make you happy. I was surrounded by family and lots of love, so I wasn't aware of the injustices until I became more of a teenager. And I was able to venture outside of our community to go in town, downtown Boston, to run an errand for my mom or pay a bill or something like that. And I was trusted to take public transportation in, and I was pretty responsible at that point. But that's when I began to face some injustices and realized that there was really a lot of prejudice and unkindness outside of my community. You know, I was pretty insulated growing up in Roxbury. Insulated by family and neighbors who were pretty much family. When, believe me, if you messed up in any way, a neighbor had permission to correct you.
I mean, we are so far from that generation at this point. A lot of us don't even know who our neighbors are anymore.
Well, you know, it's an unfortunate thing because it was something that helped to shape my life. And it was really important that we knew who our neighbors were, we respected our elders, and it was a different life. It was a different way of life. And that was the kind of insulation that I'm talking about. But it was warm and loving, you know, within those confines. But once beyond that, and sometimes even in our school environments, it was, you can recognize that there was some prejudices that were going on. But as a kid, oftentimes, it wasn't emphasized that way at home. At home, it was like, you listen to the teacher and you pay attention and you do what you're told.
Absolutely.
And your behavior in school was a reflection of your family.
Still is. With Roxbury, I mean, I can only imagine so many different changes that you've witnessed, even just coming back now after being in Cape Cod and moving back to Massachusetts. So you were around for even the busing act and like the desegregation of that and what that looked like.
Well, you know, the busing at the time when I was in Roxbury wasn't really busing at that time. They had some minor busing for Medco kids, but it wasn't at the full thrust of it. By the time it came into full flower, I had kind of moved on, and I was a young adult. I was out and gay and not really participating in it as much as folks who were either parents at the time or students. So, but it existed. We knew it was happening. It was a tumultuous time as well. The children were traumatized. The parents were traumatized. The teachers were traumatized. There was trauma going on all over the place, and it was. I can remember that a lot of parents and were unhappy, and the kids were just miserable.
You're in this documentary called Narratives in Black, and you speak about your journey of just coming out and being gay and growing up in Boston. Can you emphasize a little bit of what your coming out story is for folks who have not seen the documentary and what that was like to be in Boston at that time?
Well, you know, when I talked about and mentioned about some injustices and prejudices, where my coming out was, I thought, a joyous time. I finally thought I found my tribe. My first exposure to gay life, I was invited to, from the workplace. There was a work colleague, we were around the same age, just young men out of high school kind of thing, and I was invited to a gay club, not realizing it was gay at the time, just invited to a drag show, which I had never heard of and didn't even have any exposure to. And it was at my first exposure to gay life at that time. And I was still living at home. It was very different experience, different from what I anticipated it to be. I thought it was going to be a fun time. It was going to be around, I was enjoying myself, you know, kind of working around the edges of gay life. But once I got exposed to it, I was thrilled, but not so thrilled with, surprisingly, the prejudice that existed within the gay community. And we were being carded, we meaning that there were other black young gay men who were being carded and weren't allowed to get into the club without an escort of somebody who was white. Or I can remember being asked for ID, and I'd have an ID, and they said, well, that's not enough. We need 2 IDs, and then I'd walk with 2 IDs, and then, well, we need 2 IDs and a picture. It was like in your face oftentimes, and even if we are lucky enough to get into the club, oftentimes you were still ignored, trying to get a drink, or trying to be respected. And I think that was a difficult time. That was the most difficult time of it. And finally what came along was this one club that was all black at the time, was called Dudley Station, now Nubian Square. And it was Elite. And I can tell you, it saved all of our lives. It was it was not a very big spot. It was mostly a bar that was straight, but they had a gay night on the weekends, and it was the best thing that since sliced bread.
Who discovered Elites and who started Elites for it to even be the first black gay club?
A very dear friend who was very progressive at the time, Danny Harris, and it was through his influence, and he knew the owner of the bar, if you will, and he convinced them that this is what they need to do, and they weren't so willing to go along with it initially, but because it turned into such a moneymaker, folks were just lined up outside trying to get in. It was much more than they anticipated, much more than they expected, and they embraced it. It was a very successful venture for them, and it was a lifesaver for a lot of us gay black guys during that time.
Wow, you just said Dudley Station, and it is now Nubian Square. I can only imagine like what that felt like for you to see the change of that name and the significance of why we needed to change that name. Do you still, because like there's some Bostonians still that are like Dudley. Do you still call it Dudley, or do you now call it
I slip up
New?
from time to time and still call it Dudley.
Okay.
It's still the transportation hub, as it were, and it still is a hub for transportation. But at the time, it was both buses and trains. It was an elevated train system. It was the Orange Line that wound its way around down Washington Street from Eggleston into Dudley Station, and went from there to downtown Boston. And it was all above ground. It was elevated rail at the time.
Wow.
But I remember having to take a bus from the hood to Dudley Station to change and get the train, and it was always a single fare. You would pay your fare on the bus and get a transfer and to the train. So it was, but it's gone through a lot of transformation. That whole elevated structure is all gone.
Yeah.
The transformation even of an iconic building, now which is the bowling building,
yeah.
was Ferdinand's Furniture Store, and it was the place where everybody from the community went to buy furniture and on time. So it was very different. That neighborhood had a lot of black-owned businesses, and it was the hub of our community, and that was where we shopped. For both food and clothing goods, appliances, all of those kinds of things were in that immediate area now known as Nubian Square.
Roxbury looks so different now. Like, even when you look, I've been in Boston for 18 years and I moved to Roxbury, and gentrification has definitely affected all of Roxbury. I mean, all of Massachusetts really, but mostly we see areas like Roxbury, Dorchester, Jamaica Plain. All those areas do not look the same as what they did 18 years ago. So to be here and be from here and watch all that change, what enacted this like advocacy and activism, essentially, because you are an activist. I know that that's not what we said in the bio, but I feel like when you use your voice and raise awareness, and not only that, but your actions are that every single day that you wake up, you are an activist. Did any of that spark some of like where you are today?
Well, at the time when I was living in Boston prior to going to moving to New York, I didn't consider myself an activist or an advocate so much at that time. I was really just looking for some space to be myself and be my authentic self. And I thought that was, New York ended up being the place where I could do all of that and then some. They had black clubs, they had a black culture, they had a black gay communities that were embracing and was easy. It was not difficult, it was not, I wasn't faced with the same kinds of prejudices and obstacles and challenges that I had in Boston, which is one of the reasons that I left. So, but those changes that have happened to Boston, in Boston, that whole gentrification thing is, it's not just happened in Boston, it happened across the country.
Yeah.
It even in New York, I can tell you about neighborhoods that I lived in have been completely transformed. I lived in Tribeca for 20 years.
Wow.
And at the time that I moved to Tribeca, they probably had 3 street lights, and it was mostly warehouses that were still active. And I had to remember trying to get to work, walking in the street to get around the trucks that were backed up to the buildings.
Wow.
Now they're all multi-million-dollar lofts. So that gentrification thing has happened both where I lived as an adult, but mostly here in Boston, now that I've come back to Massachusetts and recognized all of the changes. I drove all the time when I was in Boston. I always had a car, but and I knew the streets like the back of my hand. Now I'm running into streets and I'm going in the wrong direction. You know, it's a one-way street now. Those kinds of things. So that is a huge transformation. They've redirected the streets. They've rezoned neighborhoods. Roxbury used to go up as far as Grove Hall. Now it's Grove Hall is Dorchester.
Dorchester, yeah.
Yeah, so lots of changes.
And the bike lanes. We just got to name that because
Well, that's a whole nother story.
the bike lanes. But we ain't gonna talk about it here.
We're not going to talk about the bike lanes.
You were present for the Stonewall Uprising during a visit to New York City in 1969. What stands out in your memory from that experience, and how did it shape your understanding of queer liberation?
Well, I was still living in Boston at the time, and I had met my husband, my now husband, a year prior, and we met in New York on a trip to New York that I made, and was at a birthday party. But I say that to say that we thought we were going to have a bit of a long-distance relationship, but it wasn't working out. He was still in college in North Carolina, but his parents lived in New York, and he was home on a holiday break, which is how we met. But we communicated a little bit, but it kind of waned out. And I decided I was just going to make a trip to New York on my own without telegraphing him. Strangely enough, I found myself in the Village, somewhere between 7th Avenue and the Piers at West Street. And someone ran down the street, was hollering, "Come on, we got to go to Sheridan Square. The drag queens are fighting the cops."
Oh.
And I hauled all the way back up to Greenwich Street to the square, where it's called Sheridan Square, and Stonewall, unbeknown to me, was just a small little bar club at the time, but outside were these drag queens and young people, young folks of color as well. In fact, there were a lot of young folks of color who were just taunting the police, and I didn't see what initially happened, because by the time I got to the square, it was packed. There was, I was probably 10, 20 deep with the crowds that were gathered around that little square, that little park area that they had was fenced in, and I could see what was going on the opposite side. And I can tell you, I've mentioned this many times before, our community owes a huge debt of gratitude to our transgender brothers and sisters, because they were right on the front line, and they were taking the knocks for us, even years prior, but that it was one of those nights that apparently they had just about enough, and they weren't going to take it anymore. And they started fighting back, and the first time I had ever seen the cops on the defensive. They were always ready to come through, and it was pervasive even in Boston at the time. They come through clubs and trying to get a payoff and harassing the patrons. And apparently that was what they did on a regular at Stonewall. And that particular night, it just wasn't going to happen anymore. And the community rose up. It was one of those things that was spontaneous, but it happened. And I can tell you, it changed everything. That was the spark of the gay revolution.
What you said about our transgendered brothers and sisters is so pivotal, because when you say that, I immediately think of Marsha P. Johnson. Did you ever get to meet her?
I only saw her. I didn't really meet her. Okay. But I knew who she was because people pointed her out to me. But I can tell you that it wasn't just Marsha P. Johnson who was out there at that Stonewall Uprising, because I don't really call it a riot. a riot to me is very different. I mean, I know the riots because there were riots that were happening a year prior when Martin Luther King was killed.
Yes.
And those were riots.
Yes.
This was more of an uprising. They were pushing back, and they weren't looting stores and breaking up windows and things like that.
Or burning cars or nothing.
That was far from a riot.
Okay.
But it certainly was an uprising, and folks were just pushing back and not taking what was being hurled upon them by people with badges.
What do you think that energy was like? What do you think that was like the final straw at that point? Because you did name that these cops came in frequently and was always trying to basically exert their power over folks. What do you think it was about that moment in that time that people were just like, I'm over it?
It was just I guess it's about, sometimes, it happens as it had, it was reminiscent to me, the riots when Martin Luther King had gotten killed. People had just had enough.
Yeah.
I mean, the most non-violent leader ever. And that was his whole concept of resistance was nonviolence. And for him to be taken out in such a violent way really disturbed people, and it dashed everybody's hope that we might have an opportunity to have some advancement. And I can tell you, as a community, as a black person, as a black man who just happens to be gay, we'd had enough. And folks were just, they were lashing out, unfortunately, only within their own communities, but that was the only way that they can relieve their frustrations and show that their disappointment in all of it. And that was kind of how it was, I think, at Stonewall. Folks had been harassed and disrespected and brutalized on multiple occasions. And it gets to a point that you just kind of, as my husband says, they're sick and tired of being sick and tired. So, there was always a breaking point, and there's always a boiling point. And that night happened to be it.
We are talking about 1969 as if we're not in 2025 dealing with a lot of the same things. I feel like right now we're witnessing, and I'm going to get back to some more questions about your past, but then also just pausing for a second to give a glimpse of the future. It's like we're here now. We're also in a Trump administration. I feel like we're entering what we call like a reckoning. What do you think is going to be the breaking point for us to uprise in this moment that can affect the next 10 to 20 years?
I think, folks are already in the mode now. They are finally, as a society, woke. Woke was, the narrative around woke was captured and turned on its head. That woke was just being aware of what's happening around you. And being aware of the injustices, being aware that you're not being treated properly. That's kind of woke and being aware. But America finally woke up because it's affecting everybody. It's not just black people and folks of color. We're, for the most part, people of color and minorities, as it were. We're kind of used to not living on the margins and not being respected or giving opportunities like as we know we should and we are capable of. We just need the opportunities in order for us to shine. But those have been dashed with all of the budget cuts and the job losses and those kinds of things and the takeovers. I can tell you, America has finally woken up. It's not just about the Democrats or black people. It's about everybody has been impacted in one way or another. If they haven't lost a job or been impacted, they're being impacted by the cuts.
That part, and they're also being impacted by the ports closing. Like LA, we've even heard, even just this past week, that some of the shelves some items, products, things that we eat, things that we use are not even on the shelves anymore, and people are thinking, oh, this isn't going to affect us, but it's like, well, if it's in LA, it can definitely be in our own city.
It's got to be here in 2 more seconds and in full force. We're just now, in my mind, we're seeing just the tip of the iceberg. It's because it hasn't really impacted us, and it has in the grocery stores, but it hasn't necessarily in every other way. And it's on the way, and it's going to hit full force. And folks are they know it's coming. They can anticipate what it's going to be like and how difficult it's going to be for folks to get by. Most folks are just doing what they have to do to get by on a daily basis.
This is very true.
And it's not like, you have to be living in poverty in order to feel like you've been disenfranchised. But I can tell you, most of America is being impacted. If you're not wealthy or have a family wealth legacy, you are going to be impacted by rent, mortgage, daily living.
Transportation is going to be the biggest one, I feel like.
Everything.
Yeah.
The price of gasoline, the price of energy, all of that is being increased. We're feeling it now.
Yes.
We're feeling it now, but it was interesting that, as I prepare for upcoming June Pride events for elders of color, I'm in the process of trying to purchase some swag, and there are literally tariffs
Yes.
on the price of things that has
Yes.
increased it 20%.
Jeff Bezos just made that announcement, though.
So that's the kind of things that I'm talking about that are impacting how we're going to see the impact of it, and it's just the tip of the iceberg.
So we need to get creative, it sounds like, as far as like how we move. Back in the day, we used to have a barter system. So what does that look like now? Also, what does it look like to actually like garden and be farmers and grow our own food so that we're not so reliant?
Yeah, I think it's going to end up being a lot of that. I can remember when growing up in Roxbury, neighbors looked out for one another. It wasn't like they didn't have food banks and, what do you call it? You can go and get food.
Like places like the Daily Table and things like that.
Food pantries, that's the word I'm
Pantries,
looking
there it
for.
is.
Yeah. But what you had were neighbors and relatives who would bring you stuff or would buy something in bulk.
Or you could ask for sugar from your downstairs neighbor.
Because you knew your neighbors, and neighbors knew your situation. Oftentimes, particularly, where I grew up in my era, there were big families. Everybody had a big family. Most people came from a big family. It was almost unheard of to have a family of 2 or 3 children. That was very rare. Most families that I knew of in my childhood and growing up, there were minimum of 6 kids. I grew my immediate family, or my siblings. There's 6 of us.
Wow.
So and we were considered just kind of an average family, kind of average. But there were families I know. My mother was the oldest of 10. I had friends who, were.
I'm sorry. I'm like, God bless these women. My whole face. I'm like, 10 kids is a lot.
Contraceptives were not available at that time. So that it was, and it was considered your duty as a woman to reproduce.
Yeah, and now here we are in 2025, fighting for reproduction rights.
All over again.
All over again.
When we just thought at some point that had been put to bed, and folks were taking it for granted, so to speak. And now here we are fighting that same fight all over again. We're fighting for voting rights all over again. I remember having, being exposed to the protests that were happening across the country around voting rights, and the tragedies that happened as a result of the freedom ride, the bus rides, through the South, all of that in the name of voting rights. When we finally got it in '64, it was a milestone, and now here we are fighting for the same right all over again. It seemed like history repeating itself.